Sometimes the table you fear the most is the one where your future quietly takes a seat before you do. Ethan Walker almost laughed when his friend Megan Brooks shoved the reservation card into his hand and told him to stop inventing excuses. One dinner, she had insisted with a grin that usually meant she had already made up her mind. My sister deserves a good man, and you deserve one evening where nobody asks you to fix a leaking sink or work overtime. Ethan had looked down at the card, then toward the framed photo of his 8-year-old daughter Lily sitting on the corner of his apartment bookshelf. Every important decision in his life seemed to begin with that little smile looking back at him. Since losing his wife years earlier, every dollar, every hour, every dream had quietly rearranged itself around one little girl who still believed her father could solve almost anything except finding time for himself. Blind dates belonged to another lifetime. They belonged to younger men who weren't calculating grocery bills while packing school lunches before sunrise. Still, Lily had noticed the invitation sitting on the kitchen counter that morning. "You should go, Daddy," she had said while spreading strawberry jam across her toast with careful little hands. "Miss Carter says everybody deserves a friend." Ethan smiled at the memory as he parked outside the downtown restaurant just after 7. The summer evening wrapped the city in soft amber light, and the sidewalks hummed with couples, families, and the quiet rhythm of people chasing ordinary happiness. He adjusted the sleeves of his navy button-down shirt, the nicest one he owned, silently hoping no one would notice it was nearly 5 years old. The hostess welcomed him with a warm smile and led him toward a corner table where a woman with chestnut hair was already standing to greet him. Claire Bennett's smile was genuine, the kind that reached her eyes before her lips. "Ethan," she asked softly, "I was beginning to think Megan scared you away." He chuckled. She tried the opposite. They both laughed, and for one brief moment, the awkwardness dissolved before it had the chance to settle. Claire wasn't dressed to impress anyone. No expensive jewelry. No rehearsed confidence. Just quiet kindness that reminded Ethan of people who listened before they spoke. They had barely taken their seats when Ethan glanced across the dining room without thinking. His heartbeat slowed, then stopped. At a table only a few feet away, beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier, sat Victoria Hayes, the CEO of Hayes Dynamics, the woman whose signature approved every promotion, every budget, and every career inside the company where Ethan had spent the last 7 years building machines that carried someone else's name. She wasn't alone. Several executives surrounded her, discussing papers spread neatly across the polished table. Victoria lifted her eyes for only a second. Their gazes met. Recognition flickered between them. She said nothing. Ethan said nothing. She simply offered the smallest professional nod before returning to her meeting, as though nothing unusual had happened. But something had, because in that single silent moment, one table held a blind date, another held his boss, and neither of them yet realized that before the night was over, every assumption they carried about the quiet single father across the room would begin to change. Claire noticed the subtle change in Ethan's expression before he realized it himself. She followed his eyes for only a heartbeat, just long enough to see a group of sharply dressed executives gathered around an elegant table near the windows, but she did not recognize any of them. Instead of asking immediately, she simply folded her menu and smiled with quiet patience. "Everything okay?" she asked. Ethan looked back at her and offered the kind of smile people practiced after years of carrying responsibilities that could not be shared. "Yes," he answered gently. "Just someone from work." Claire nodded without pressing further. That alone surprised him. Most first dates he had reluctantly agreed to over the years had eventually become interviews disguised as conversations. People wanted to know his salary, his future plans, whether he ever intended to move into management, or why a man nearing 40 was still raising a child alone. Claire asked none of those questions. Instead, she looked toward the bread basket the waiter had just placed between them and laughed softly. "My sister forgot to tell you one thing." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "I judge restaurants by the bread before anything else." Ethan chuckled. "That sounds like a dangerous system. It has never failed me." The easy laughter settled between them like warm candlelight, dissolving the remaining awkwardness. Across the room, Victoria Hayes signed one page after another while her executives debated numbers that seemed to grow larger with every sentence. Yet twice within only a few minutes, her attention drifted toward Ethan's table. Not because he was speaking loudly. In fact, he barely spoke at all. He listened, really listened. She watched him pause before answering Claire, giving every question the same thoughtful attention he gave engineering meetings back at the office. It was strange. Inside the company, Ethan Walker was known for solving impossible design problems with remarkable calm, then quietly returning to his desk before anyone could congratulate him. No one talked much about his personal life because he never offered pieces of it. Victoria had assumed he preferred it that way. "So," Claire asked after their meals arrived, "what does your daughter think about tonight?" Ethan smiled before he even answered. "She told me everyone deserves a friend." Claire lowered her fork and laughed with genuine delight. "That is probably the wisest dating advice I have ever heard." Ethan shook his head. "She is usually wiser than I am." Claire noticed the softness in his eyes the moment he mentioned Lily. It was not performance. It was not practiced. It was the quiet certainty of someone whose greatest accomplishment would never appear on a resume. "Tell me about her," Claire said. Ethan leaned back slightly as though opening a favorite book. He described Lily's love for drawing horses that somehow always ended up with rainbow-colored manis. He talked about Saturday morning pancakes that rarely looked like pancakes by the time they reached the table. He admitted he had become surprisingly good at braiding hair after dozens of failed attempts watched patiently by an 8-year-old teacher. Claire laughed until tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. At the neighboring table, Victoria could not hear every word, but she heard enough. She heard joy. She heard humility. She heard a father speaking about his daughter with more pride than he had ever spoken about multi-million-dollar projects. One executive interrupted her thoughts by sliding another report across the table. "We still need approval tonight," he said. Victoria looked down at the document, but her attention lingered elsewhere. For the first time since Ethan Walker had joined Hayes Dynamics 7 years earlier, she realized she knew almost everything about his professional performance and almost nothing about the man himself. Somehow, that discovery felt far more significant than the numbers waiting beneath her pen. Claire rested her glass of iced tea on the table and studied Ethan with quiet curiosity. There was something reassuring about the way he spoke, never rushing to fill silence, never trying to impress anyone with carefully polished stories. Every answer seemed honest enough to leave room for imperfections. "Megan told me you build machines," Claire said with a smile. Ethan shrugged modestly. "Mostly I help solve problems after somebody smarter than me creates them." Claire laughed. "That sounds suspiciously humble." Ethan smiled into his coffee. "It is just engineering. At the end of the day, people remember how you treated them a lot longer than they remember which blueprint you finished first." Across the room, Victoria had just concluded another discussion about quarterly projections when one of the executives excused himself to answer a telephone call. The conversation around her briefly faded into the background. Her eyes drifted once again toward Ethan without intention, almost as if the calm around his table had become impossible to ignore. Claire leaned forward. "Can I ask something personal?" Ethan nodded. "You can always ask. What made you actually agree to tonight?" Ethan looked toward the restaurant windows where the city lights shimmered against the glass like scattered stars. "Honestly," Claire smiled. "Please. My daughter packed a peppermint into my jacket pocket this morning." Claire looked confused. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed the small wrapped candy beside his coffee cup. "She said if I became nervous, I should remember that good people usually smile before they speak." Claire's eyes softened. "She sounds extraordinary." Ethan looked at the candy for a long moment before answering. "She makes ordinary days feel extraordinary." Victoria happened to hear only that final sentence. She lowered the pen in her hand without realizing it. During countless board meetings, she had watched executives compete for promotions, bonuses, recognition, and influence. Yet the engineer everyone quietly depended upon seemed proudest of a sentence about his little girl. Something about that unsettled her assumptions. One of the directors beside Victoria continued outlining cost reductions. "We should ask engineering to work weekends until the deadline passes." Victoria listened automatically. Another executive added, "Walker can handle it. He never complains." Victoria glanced toward Ethan again. "Never complains." The words echoed differently now. She realized she had accepted that reputation for years without asking what those extra weekends might actually cost him. Back at Ethan's table, dinner arrived with the comforting aroma of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. The soft clink of silverware mixed with quiet piano music drifting through hidden speakers overhead. Claire smiled as she tasted the bread she had jokingly declared so important. "Official verdict," she announced. "This place passes." Ethan laughed. "I was worried for a minute." "You should have been." They both laughed again, and for the first time all evening Ethan felt the tightness in his shoulders begin to disappear. Claire did not make him feel like someone being evaluated. She made him feel seen. "Can I ask one more thing?" she said gently. Ethan nodded. "What is the hardest part about being a father?" He answered almost immediately, "Wondering every night if you gave them enough. Enough patience, enough encouragement, enough memories that they will keep after they grow up." Claire remained silent for several seconds. Finally she whispered, "That is probably the most beautiful answer I have ever heard." At that exact moment the lights above the dining room flickered once. Conversations paused. Forks rested on plates. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the evening sky beyond the windows, followed by rain striking the glass in steady waves. Waiters hurried toward the entrance as guests glanced outside, realizing the unexpected summer storm had arrived far sooner than anyone had predicted. None of them knew that within minutes the weather would quietly rearrange every table in the restaurant, placing 3 lives on the same path in a way none of them could have planned. The rain intensified within minutes, drumming steadily against the restaurant windows until the streets outside disappeared behind a curtain of silver. Another flash of lightning illuminated the dining room for an instant before the lights flickered again, this time lingering in darkness long enough for conversations to fade into uncertain silence. A few guests reached for their telephones, while others laughed nervously as emergency lights cast a warm amber glow across polished wood floors and white tablecloths. The restaurant manager stepped into the center of the room with an apologetic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are experiencing a temporary electrical issue because of the storm. Our backup system is working, but we need to rearrange several tables while our staff adjusts the dining area." Ethan looked toward Claire with an amused smile. "Well, this certainly makes a first date memorable." Claire laughed softly. "At least nobody can blame us if the evening gets awkward." Before either of them could continue, one of the servers approached with an embarrassed expression. "I am so sorry to ask this, but would you mind sharing one of our larger tables for a little while? Several reservations have been affected by the power issue." Ethan glanced around the room. Nearly every available seat had already filled with guests being relocated. "Of course," he answered without hesitation. Claire nodded. "That is perfectly fine." The server smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you so much. Please follow me." They gathered their drinks and quietly crossed the dining room. Ethan did not notice where they were heading until they stopped beside the very table he had hoped to avoid all evening. Victoria Hayes stood as the server explained the situation. 2 executives had decided to continue their meeting remotely and had already left through the side entrance before the storm became worse, leaving several empty chairs. "Miss Hayes," the server said apologetically, "would it be all right if these guests shared your table until we finish reorganizing the dining room?" Victoria looked first at the server, then at Ethan, then at Claire. Her expression remained composed, but there was the slightest pause before she answered. "Of course. Everyone deserves a dry place to finish dinner." Ethan gave a polite nod. "Thank you." "You are welcome, Mr. Walker." Claire's eyes moved between them with growing curiosity. "So you two really do know each other?" Victoria smiled professionally. "Ethan is one of our engineers." Ethan added quietly, "Miss Hayes is the Chief Executive Officer at Hayes Dynamics." Claire blinked once before looking at Victoria with genuine surprise. "Now I understand why you both looked so startled earlier." Victoria offered a small laugh. "I imagine neither of us expected tonight." They settled into their new seats as waiters carried fresh candles from table to table. Their gentle flames reflected across crystal glasses, replacing bright electric lights with a softer warmth that somehow made the room feel more personal. For several moments, no one spoke. The only sounds were distant thunder, quiet piano music returning through battery-powered speakers, and rain falling steadily beyond the windows. Finally, Claire smiled at Victoria. "Since we are unexpectedly sharing dinner, I think introductions should start over. I am Claire Bennett." Victoria extended her hand warmly. "Victoria Hayes. It is nice to meet you." Claire glanced at Ethan with a playful grin. "Your friend Megan forgot to mention that this evening came with executive leadership." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, unable to hide a sheepish smile. "She leaves out important details sometimes." Even Victoria smiled at that. It was small, almost invisible, but genuine. For the first time in years, she was not looking across a conference table at one of her employees. She was simply sharing dinner with a quiet father, a thoughtful woman, and a storm that had unexpectedly erased every comfortable distance between them. The candlelight softened every face around the table, washing away the invisible lines that usually separated executives from employees and strangers from friends. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, turning the busy streets into shimmering reflections of red brake lights and glowing storefronts. For the first time that evening, nobody seemed to be in a hurry. Claire smiled as she broke a piece of warm bread and looked at Victoria. "So, what is Ethan like at work?" Ethan immediately sighed. "I am suddenly very nervous about this conversation." Victoria looked at him for a moment before answering. "Quiet." Claire laughed. "That does not surprise me." Victoria continued, her voice thoughtful rather than formal. "He is usually the last person to speak during meetings, but when he finally does, everyone starts taking notes." Ethan shook his head modestly. "That is an exaggeration." "No," Victoria replied gently. "It is accurate." Claire looked between them with growing curiosity. "Then you must have known each other for years." 7 years, Victoria answered. "Long enough for me to trust his judgment on every major engineering project we have completed." Ethan lowered his eyes toward his coffee. Praise always made him uncomfortable. Claire noticed it immediately. "You really do not enjoy compliments, do you?" Ethan smiled. "I just think good work should speak for itself." Victoria quietly repeated those words in her mind. Good work should speak for itself. Somehow that sentence described Ethan far better than any performance review she had ever signed. Before anyone could continue, Ethan's telephone vibrated softly across the table. The screen lit up with a smiling picture of Lily wearing oversized gardening gloves and missing one front tooth. Ethan excused himself with an apologetic smile. "Would you mind if I answer? She always calls before bed." Claire's answer came instantly. "Please do." Victoria nodded as well. Ethan accepted the call, and Lily's cheerful voice filled the quiet space between them. "Hi, Daddy. Did you remember the peppermint?" Ethan laughed warmly. "I did. Your advice worked." "Good. Did you smile first?" "I think so." Lily giggled. "Did your new friend smile too?" Ethan glanced toward Claire, who smiled and waved toward the telephone. She definitely smiled. Claire leaned closer. "Hello, Lily. I have heard wonderful things about your pancake masterpieces." Lily gasped dramatically. "Daddy told you about those?" "He did. Do not believe everything he says. Sometimes they look like dinosaurs." The three adults laughed together, and even Victoria found herself smiling without realizing it. Lily continued excitedly. "Miss Carter put my horse drawing on the classroom wall today. I cannot wait to show Daddy tomorrow." "I cannot wait either," Ethan answered softly. "Now promise me you will brush your teeth before Grandma reads your bedtime story." "I already did." "Good night, Daddy. Love you." Ethan's voice became almost a whisper. "Love you more than every star in the sky." The call ended, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt fuller than conversation. Claire looked down at her folded hands for a moment before speaking. "She adores you." Ethan smiled gently. "She makes it easy to be a father." Victoria stared quietly at the extinguished screen resting beside Ethan's coffee cup. In 7 years, she had reviewed his annual evaluations, approved project budgets carrying his recommendations, and relied upon his calm decisions during impossible deadlines. Yet she had never imagined this version of the man sitting across from her. She had never known he scheduled every meeting around school pickups, answered bedtime calls no matter where he was, or carried a peppermint in his pocket because an 8-year-old believed courage sometimes came wrapped in red and white paper. At that moment, Victoria realized something uncomfortable. She knew Ethan Walker's employee identification number by memory, but she had never taken the time to know the person who carried it. The storm showed no sign of ending. Rain continued to trace silver paths down the windows while the restaurant settled into a slower rhythm, as though everyone inside had silently accepted that the evening would last a little longer than expected. Fresh coffee arrived, followed by warm slices of apple pie that the manager had offered to every guest as an apology for the inconvenience. Claire smiled as she accepted her plate. This may be the first blind date in history improved by bad weather. Ethan laughed. I cannot argue with free pie. Even Victoria smiled, though her thoughts had drifted somewhere far beyond dessert. She watched Ethan thank the waiter by name after reading the small embroidered tag on his uniform. It was such a simple gesture, yet the young waiter left the table smiling a little wider than before. Victoria had attended countless executive dinners where people discussed leadership for hours. Ethan had just demonstrated it without saying a single impressive word. Claire noticed it too. You always remember people's names? She asked. Ethan looked slightly surprised by the question. I try. Everybody likes knowing they matter. Claire rested her fork on the plate. That is becoming a pattern tonight. Ethan tilted his head. What is? You notice people before you notice yourself. Ethan looked down for a quiet moment. My father used to say respect costs nothing, but it pays interest for a lifetime. Victoria found herself remembering the first week Ethan had joined Hayes Dynamics. He had been introduced as an engineer with exceptional technical ability. Yet what everyone remembered afterward was how he had stayed late helping the maintenance staff move heavy equipment before unpacking his own office. At the time, she had dismissed it as simple kindness. Tonight, she wondered if it was simply who he had always been. Claire leaned back comfortably. Can I confess something? Ethan smiled. Only if I can too. She laughed. Fair enough. When Megan told me she wanted to introduce me to a single father, I assumed you would spend the entire evening talking about how difficult life had been. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And instead you keep talking about how lucky you are. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered windows where distant headlights blurred into soft streaks of light. Because I am. Life has been difficult sometimes. But Lily laughs every morning before school. I have friends who refuse to let me disappear into work. I have a job that lets me provide for my daughter. That sounds like a pretty fortunate man to me. The words settled gently over the table. Claire felt admiration growing into something deeper, something she had not expected when she accepted her sister's invitation. Across from her, Victoria experienced a different emotion entirely. It was not sudden attraction. It was respect quietly reshaping itself into genuine curiosity. She had spent years believing she understood the people who worked for her because she understood their results. Now she realized results revealed very little about character. Her telephone vibrated softly. A message from the board chairman appeared across the screen asking whether the emergency budget proposal had been approved. Victoria looked at the notification, then calmly locked the screen without replying immediately. For the first time in months, the numbers could wait another few minutes. The conversation around this candlelit table somehow felt more important. Ethan glanced at his watch and sighed almost apologetically. I should probably head home soon. Lily will be asleep by the time I get there, but I always check on her before I go to bed. Claire smiled warmly. She is lucky to have you. Before Ethan could answer, another restaurant employee hurried toward their table carrying a portable card reader with an embarrassed expression. I am terribly sorry, he said. Because of the power outage, our payment system is processing tables one at a time. There has also been a mistake with several checks, and I am afraid yours may have been combined. Ethan reached for the bill with his usual calm expression, completely unaware that the next few minutes would reveal far more about every person at the table than the entire evening that had come before. The young waiter looked genuinely uncomfortable as he placed the printed receipt beside Ethan's plate. I sincerely apologize, he said. When we had to move everyone because of the storm, 2 tables were accidentally merged in the payment system. We are fixing it, but right now this is the only bill that printed. Ethan glanced at the total without changing his expression. It included not only his dinner with Claire, but also the meals and beverages from Victoria's executive meeting. The amount was well over $600. Claire leaned closer and quietly whispered, "That cannot be right." Before Ethan could answer, the waiter nodded anxiously. "It is definitely incorrect, sir. We are working on separating everything, but it may take another 20 or 30 minutes while the system reboots." Ethan looked at his watch. It was already much later than he had planned. Lily would be asleep by now, and although she was safely staying with her grandmother, he never liked being away longer than necessary. He smiled reassuringly at the waiter. "It is all right. Mistakes happen." The waiter blinked, clearly expecting frustration instead of kindness. "Thank you for understanding." Ethan studied the receipt once more before quietly reaching for his wallet. Claire gently touched his sleeve. "You are not actually thinking about paying that, are you?" Ethan smiled softly. "The restaurant has had a difficult night. They have been apologizing to everyone for something that was not really anyone's fault. But that bill is not yours." "No," Ethan agreed calmly. "It is not." Victoria had remained silent until then, carefully observing every word. She knew Ethan earned a comfortable salary, but she also knew he was raising a daughter alone in a city where every dollar mattered. She watched him remove a credit card that showed years of careful use around the edges. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to impress anyone, just the quiet instinct to solve a problem before it became someone else's burden. "Mr. Walker," Victoria said gently, "please put your wallet away." Ethan looked toward her. "The restaurant will correct it eventually." "Perhaps." He smiled. "But they have already had enough stress tonight." Claire stared at him with disbelief mixed with admiration. Most people would argue for half an hour over a mistake like this. Ethan shrugged lightly. "People remember how you make them feel on their hardest days." The words settled over the table like the warm candlelight surrounding them. The young waiter lowered his eyes for a moment, obviously moved. "Sir," he said quietly, "I do not think anyone has ever reacted like that before." Ethan laughed softly. "Then tonight has been full of firsts." Victoria slowly folded her hands on the table. For years, she had evaluated leadership through presentations, performance reports, and quarterly results. Yet the most impressive example of character she had witnessed all year was unfolding over a mistaken dinner check. This was the same engineer who never asked for recognition, never competed for attention, and never complained when difficult assignments landed on his desk. Now she understood something she had overlooked for far too long. His calm was not created by the workplace. It was part of who he was. Victoria reached into her handbag and quietly placed her own company credit card beside the receipt. "This dinner was connected to my business meeting," she said with composed confidence. "Allow me to take care of it." Ethan immediately shook his head. "That is generous, but I cannot let you do that." Claire looked from one to the other, realizing neither of them was motivated by pride. Both simply wanted to spare someone else from inconvenience. Before either could continue, the restaurant manager hurried toward the table with a relieved smile and a freshly printed receipt in his hand. "Good news," he announced. "We finally fixed the system. Your checks have been separated correctly." He paused after noticing the 2 credit cards resting side by side on the table. Then he smiled in quiet amazement. "I have managed restaurants for 22 years, he said softly, "and I have never seen 2 people politely arguing over who gets to pay more instead of less." The restaurant manager smiled with visible relief as he handed each guest the correct receipt. "Thank you all for your patience," he said sincerely. "Most evenings, people remember the mistakes. Tonight, I think I will remember the kindness." Ethan accepted his bill without even checking the amount. He simply thanked the manager, paid quietly, and left a generous tip for the staff who had spent the evening apologizing for circumstances beyond their control. When the waiter noticed the tip, his eyes widened. "Sir, this is far too much." Ethan smiled gently. "Not after the night you have had." The young man swallowed hard before quietly saying, "I will remember this." Ethan simply nodded as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Victoria watched the exchange without saying a word. She had spent years surrounded by successful people, but she had learned that generosity often became smaller as bank accounts became larger. Ethan seemed to follow a completely different equation. His kindness had nothing to do with money. It was simply the way he moved through the world. The rain outside had finally begun to slow, leaving tiny droplets glistening beneath the streetlights like scattered pieces of glass. Guests started collecting umbrellas and jackets while conversations gradually faded into goodbyes. Claire slipped into her light coat and turned toward Ethan with an easy smile. "I have to admit something." Ethan looked at her curiously. "What is that?" "When Megan introduced us, I expected to meet a good father." She paused for a moment before continuing. "I did not expect to meet a genuinely good man." Ethan looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I am still learning every day." Claire shook her head softly. "That is exactly why I believe you." Victoria stood quietly beside the table, gathering the documents from what had once been an executive meeting. Those reports suddenly seemed strangely insignificant. Quarterly numbers could always be revised. Character could not. As she slipped the papers into her leather portfolio, she looked toward Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Walker." Ethan turned politely. "Yes, Miss Hayes." For the first time since either of them had joined Hayes Dynamics, Victoria hesitated before speaking. "Thank you." Ethan looked surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me that there are things more important than deadlines." Ethan smiled with the same calm warmth he had carried throughout the evening. "Deadlines matter." He glanced toward the restaurant staff cleaning tables before adding quietly, "People matter more." No one answered immediately. The silence that followed did not feel uncomfortable. It felt honest. Claire noticed the way Victoria's expression softened after hearing those words. Victoria noticed the quiet admiration growing in Claire's eyes. Neither woman felt threatened by the other. Instead, they shared an unexpected realization. The man standing before them was not trying to earn anyone's attention. He was simply living according to values that had quietly shaped every conversation that evening. Outside the restaurant, the cool night air carried the fresh scent of rain across the nearly empty sidewalks. Ethan opened the front door and instinctively stepped aside, allowing Claire and Victoria to walk through before him. Another small gesture. Another habit of respect that required no audience. Claire smiled as she reached the sidewalk. "Thank you for tonight, Ethan. I had a wonderful evening." "So did I," Ethan answered honestly. Victoria lingered for a moment beneath the restaurant awning as drivers slowly pulled to the curb to collect waiting guests. She watched Ethan glance toward the dark sky before checking the time once more, already thinking about getting home to make sure Lily was sleeping peacefully. In that quiet moment, both women reached the same conclusion without speaking it aloud. Neither admired Ethan because he was an engineer. Neither respected him because he worked hard. They admired him because every small choice he made revealed exactly the same man, whether anyone important happened to be watching or not. And neither of them realized that by the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the quiet respect born during one rainy evening would begin changing all three of their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. Monday morning arrived beneath clear blue skies as though the storm had never happened. Yet something had quietly changed in the hearts of everyone who had shared that candlelit table. Ethan returned to Hayes Dynamics exactly as he always did, carrying a travel mug of black coffee, greeting the security guard by name, and stopping to hold the elevator for two interns who looked terrified on only their second day. Nothing about his routine suggested he expected anything different from the week ahead. Inside the executive office, however, Victoria Hayes stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, thinking not about budgets or production schedules, but about a father who carried a peppermint in his pocket because his daughter believed courage could be sweet. When the weekly leadership meeting began, department heads quickly started discussing deadlines, staffing shortages, and financial projections. Halfway through the meeting, someone suggested requiring mandatory weekend overtime to recover time lost during the previous week's severe weather. The room grew quiet as everyone waited for Victoria's approval. She looked down at the proposal for several thoughtful seconds before gently closing the folder. "No," she said calmly. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Victoria continued in the same steady voice. People do their best work when they know their lives outside this building matter too. We will solve this challenge without asking families to carry the entire burden. Across the conference table, more than one manager looked surprised. They had never heard their chief executive officer speak quite that way before. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the morning exactly where everyone expected to find him, solving an engineering problem with two younger colleagues while patiently explaining each step instead of simply giving them the answer. Shortly before lunch, his telephone vibrated with a message from Claire. It read, "Thank you again for a wonderful evening. I hope Lily loved hearing about your adventure." Ethan smiled before replying. She laughed hardest about the restaurant manager thinking two people were arguing over who could pay more. "Thank you for making the evening feel easy." A few moments later, another message appeared. This one was from Victoria's assistant, politely asking whether Ethan could stop by the executive office before leaving for the day. Ethan assumed it concerned an upcoming project. He knocked gently on the open door that afternoon, and Victoria invited him inside with the same professional courtesy she always displayed. Yet this conversation felt different. "Mr. Walker," she began, "I realize there is something I should have said a long time ago." Ethan listened quietly. "Thank you for everything you have contributed to this company, not only through your work, but through the example you set for everyone around you." Ethan smiled modestly. "I have simply been doing my job." Victoria shook her head. "No, you have been reminding people what good leadership actually looks like." Ethan did not know how to answer that. He simply nodded with quiet gratitude before excusing himself to pick up Lily from school. As he walked through the parking lot beneath the warm afternoon sun, he noticed another message waiting on his telephone. It was from Claire. "Would Lily like to visit the county fair this Saturday? My treat for the lemonade." Ethan smiled, then looked toward the school where his daughter would soon come running into his arms. At that same moment, Victoria watched from her office window as Ethan drove away without any idea that he had changed the direction of her leadership with nothing more than kindness, humility, and quiet dignity. She smiled to herself and whispered words no quarterly report could ever measure. Sometimes the strongest people never raise their voices. They simply leave every table they touch a little warmer than they found it. And somewhere beyond that ordinary Monday, where second chances quietly wait for those who never stop believing in grace, three good people were already walking toward a future that had begun on a rainy evening when one unexpected seat at a dinner table became the beginning of everything.